Ragazzi, come vi stavo dicendo, il documentario che stiamo per vedere è piuttosto lungo, quindi voglio partire con largo anticipo e quindi direi di cominciare adesso. Il documentario che vedremo, come vi stavo dicendo, è un nuovo documentario di NoClip, ok? E per chi non sapesse che cosa è NoClip, è questo canale qua. È questo canale qui, NoClip Video Documentaries, ve lo segnalo molto spesso, è un bellissimo canale che fa dei documentari veramente fighi e quindi ora ne stiamo per vedere uno che è stato pubblicato veramente poche ore fa e ve lo raccomando tantissimo, è veramente figo, d'accordo? E quindi è quello che faremo adesso e il documentario è in particolare su Pentiment, The Making of Pentiment, ok? Che è un titolo che dovreste averne sentito parlare, è un titolo di nicchia ma è stato molto apprezzato, d'accordo? Quindi io direi cuffiamoci, senza ulteriore indugio, spegniamo la musica di sottofondo, apriamo l'audio, qui dovrebbe essere tutto a posto e eccoci qua, si parte. The Making of Pentiment, NoClip Documentary. Allora, i sottotitoli in italiano non ci sono nativi, ma ci sono quelli nativi in inglese, quindi fatti bene, non quelli automatici, che poi vengono tradotti in italiano, quindi dovrebbero essere abbastanza affidabili. Ok? Bene. Siete pronti? Si va.
Hey, I wanted to answer a question asked on my Tumblr by the Beard of Andronicus. He asked, why aren't historical time periods used more as settings within RPGs? There appears to be potentially interesting, well-known periods, fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, Crusading period, early Middle Ages, Renaissance Italy, etc., that would make for an interesting backdrop for an RPG, but developers seem content on relying on standard fantasy fare, judging from the last few popular releases. Is it a lack of interest on the part of the public, developers, or something else? That's an excellent question that I've been asking for about 15 years.
Producing a documentary on the development of Pentiment is kind of a no-brainer for us here at NoClip, because there's simply not another game like it. Pentiment is a 2D historical RPG set in 16th century Upper Bavaria. You play as a journeyman artist working in a Benedictine abbey overlooking the alpine town of Tassing. A unique concept for a game, which produces unique design challenges. But the story of where it was developed is also remarkable, as this wasn't put together by a small indie studio. Pentiment was created by a team of about a dozen developers inside of Obsidian Entertainment, a studio drenched in role-playing game history, from the Black Isle days of Icewind Dale, Fallout, and Planescape Torment, to Obsidian's work on Fallout New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity, The Outer Worlds, and of course another 2D RPG, this one set in 21st century Colorado. But Pentiment isn't aping any game from Obsidian's past or anyone else's. From a design perspective, almost everything about Pentiment feels like new ground. Its setting, gameplay, art style, its use of typography, explorations of themes of faith, monastic life, Middle Ages society, war, revolt, and spiritual justice. In this documentary, we're going to explore as much of this tapestry as possible. We're going to talk about the challenges of finding the game's art style, the difficulty in trying to contextualize critical historical concepts without boring players to death, how the team built a town full of distinct characters and animated them, how the font was designed, the pressure on historical fiction to be accurate, and yes, we're going to ask them about all those weird little animals hiding in the margins. We're going to avoid the major spoilers for this game as much as we can, but the final chapter of this documentary concerns the final act of the game, so we're going to give you a heads up before we get into all of that. But for now, let's start before Quill hit Parchment and explore just how a game like this gets greenlit in the first place.
I've been at Obsidian since 2005. First game I started working on here was Neverwinter Nights 2. I took over toward the end of the development as the lead designer, so I closed that out. And then after that, I worked on a few projects that got canceled, and then I directed Fallout New Vegas, and then directed Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, and most recently Pentiment. It's weird because when I talk about the inspiration for it, it was just the inspiration to make a historical role-playing game. That was about it. But the game that I drew inspiration from way back then was an early 90s game called Darklands from Microprose. and it's a pretty janky game. Like, even by the standards of the day, it was fairly janky and difficult to play. You know, it was 320 by 200, and it used like a stylized font, which is a weird choice and a weird combination of things. But it was very intriguing because it was a historical role-playing game, and it incorporated fantastic elements, but it really did feel like it was rooted in 15th century Greater Germany, which was the Holy Roman Empire. That sort of got me interested in history, and then I also studied Shakespeare's histories because I was initially in college in music and theater, and then I went over from the Conservatory of Music into the college to study history. I got my degree in history. I didn't know what I was going to do. I got in the games industry doing web design because I taught myself web design. And when I got in the industry, in my mind, my thinking was, I want to work on a D&D game, which I got to do immediately because I worked on Icewind Dale at Black Isle. I wanted to work on a Fallout game, which I didn't get to do, and then I later got to do. And then the third one was a historical game, and it eluded me for a long time. A lot of the people I talked to about it were very skeptical about the idea of historical games in general. I think it's a lot of cases people have bad experiences with history in school. They don't like the way it's taught. It's very memorizing dates and things like that. So I said, yeah, I'm gonna skip the boring parts, right? Like, when I say I'm gonna do something historical, assume it's the cool things in history. But it took a very long time, and around, I would say 2018 or so, I had played Night in the Woods, and I had thought about the idea of doing something that was structurally similar to Night in the Woods, but aesthetically more like late medieval, early modern illuminated manuscripts and woodcuts, and more of a narrative RPG, really. So focusing not on combat.
Comunque in questi ultimi anni l'interesse per la storia antica e anche più moderna si è decisamente ravvivato. Io stesso ho imparato un sacco di cose ed è molto figo.
And then Microsoft acquired us, and around that time I was like, okay, they have Game Pass, and I'm pretty sure that they want kind of like smaller, unique titles for it. And this is probably the only chance I'm going to get to do this, so I just went for it.
What was the process of making that pitch deck, I guess?
Oh, I never made a pitch deck. Yeah, I went to Fergus while we were being acquired, and I said, hey man, I'm pretty burned out from working on Deadfire, so if I'm going to stay here, I got to work on something really small. And I said, I promise you, it's not going to be more than a dozen people. It was 13 people, but it's not going to be more than a dozen people. I'm not going to work on it forever. I'm not going to lose money. And then I'll go back to working on sort of more traditional stuff if that's what we need at the studio. So, and he was like, okay, you can do that. There was like no resistance. He was like, okay, yeah, you want to work on that, that's fine. So at first, the only other person I really had to work with, and it was part-time, was Hannah Kennedy, who's our art director. And I knew that if she couldn't kind of build the art style, that I would not get any traction. So I described it to her. I said, I want elements of late medieval illuminated manuscripts. I want elements of early modern woodcuts, but I don't want to copy them directly. I want to synthesize something out of that for a singular art style. So Hannah worked through that, and she's extremely analytical. She broke down like what makes up those art styles, what defines them, and what distinguishes them. And then she started ideating on it. Even her early examples showed a lot of promise. The early examples are quite different from what we wound up with, but it really didn't take that long to get to something where people are like, whoa, that looks pretty cool. That looks really interesting.
I tend to approach problem solving like that in a very sort of puzzly way, especially when you're put in this position where it's like, anything could be the answer. So I have what I'm personally excited about. And so for, I think, myself and Josh, we were both excited about the historical context and getting able to reference that and be spiritually true to kind of just calling back on that look. But then I knew that right away there would also be challenges of like, if we just did this one for one, if I just copied this look and tried to make a game that functioned with that look, here are the things that would be difficult about that. So figuring that out right away, beyond preference of just what are our limitations if we did want to make this look exactly like a painting. So there are some things about kind of textural complexity, things getting really, really crunchy looking, things being difficult to navigate if you were trying to, like, you know, a painting is beautiful, but it's a fixed frame. So with games, you have to think about the composition similar to film, similar to animation. You have a moving camera that the player also has control of, and all of that kind of influences your limitations on what the look can look like. So I think we kind of went through a phase of establishing like, all right, this would be challenging to see. We know we want it to feel at least this big. How can we make it feel large without still making it like a completely open world exploration space? So I kind of tackled it having that bullet list of here's all the things that might be limitations, and also here's the things that I think would be really cool to be able to do. And then after having that, that's when I kind of sat down and did some experiments then of taking reference material from history, reference material from other games, and then reference material from animation, kind of knowing that those were going to be the three spaces we were majorly pulling from.
Ok, scusate, ero mutato. Buonasera, Luigi Bor, Universo, ben trovati
really
a tutti.
Kind of landing on exactly what that look was going to be. It's not like we just did here's our test phase and we're going to do a whole bunch of variations and then go, that's the one, and go forward. It did evolve over time as we encountered problems or things we still needed to solve. For one example was we didn't really understand it was going to be a limitation of traversal going into a scene when it's all 2D, because then you have to think okay, is the guy going to shrink as they walk away? Or does it stay the same and then they technically are moving up? And that's one thing where it's people that have made a lot of platformers are probably yeah, that's an obvious problem. Of course you have to consider that. And I was I've never worked on a game in exactly this structure, so just none of us expected that to be a thing. And when we encountered it, we were okay, no walking into scenes, only diagonally up staircases, one way or the other, hills. And then that also then in turn kind of influenced the look and the way that the scenes were laid out.
I mean, that honestly was one of the bigger challenges that we struggled with on the project. I mean, it's not nearly as complicated as a 3D project, for example, but that is the challenge of a 2D project in the perspective that we were driving with the art style that we were driving was how do we handle the layering and the sorting, and especially when you have a character that's cutting something on a cutting board. How do you get the character to be over the sprite, but some of the character to be behind the sprite, kind of thing. So figuring out those processes and figuring out how the artists and the animators were going to set that up was definitely a challenge. I was number 4 or 5 on the team, so I was one of the principals that was hired on. You can't do much without programming, so we're the first ones to come on the project and one of the last to leave. So I worked on Pillars of Eternity for about 3 weeks, and then I was shuffled on to Tyranny. So most of my time prior to Pentiment was on Tyranny, and then I left for a bit, and then when Pentiment was in development, I was an option that came up, and the project was just very irresistible to me. So a small team with the resources that Microsoft and Obsidian have was pretty hard to turn down. So yeah, the majority of an Obsidian programmer's time is tooling. To be honest, we're a design-driven studio, so we really focus on making sure that we develop the tools and the processes in place to empower our designers and our artists to do the work themselves.
When we got Alec Fry and Brett Closter and a few other, Kathy Nichols, that was sort of our core prototype team. And that allowed us to do the prototype. And at that point, honestly, the game looked, I would say, 85% like it did at the end. So obviously the end game is much bigger and it has visual effects and more polish, but the visual style was established, animation style was established. And it wasn't until after we already had the prototype that we showed it to Xbox, and they were very enthusiastic about it, so it went well. The prototype focused on the Abbey. One of the things that we talked about early on was, much like in the film of The Name of the Rose, The Name of the Rose was a big inspiration for the game in a lot of ways. There was a film in 1986 by Jean-Jacques Annaud, and he chose to have extremely unique-looking people cast for the monks, because he said if you have this big cast and it's all basically, with the exception of one guy, it's all white men in robes, largely indistinguishable, you have to have people that are very unique looking. And he tried to cast people that looked like men from his village that he thought were just he said pretty ugly, but it made them very memorable. And so Hannah said, well, we face sort of a similar problem. We were actually inspired a lot by Cartoon Saloon and the approach that they took, for example, in Secret of Kells, where also they had quite a few monks, but they really exaggerated proportion and bodily features and things like that. We didn't go as broad as they did, because theirs are really exaggerated, but we toned it down. But we said, if we can distinguish between the monks and the nuns in this large cast of monastics, then we'll probably have a pretty good chance of being able to extend that to the villagers.
I think it was kind of a cruel joke that Josh put it in a monastery where they're all going to be wearing the exact same outfit. No, that was one of the most immediate challenges right away. At the beginning of production, the cast, for all of us, we had anticipated it being a lot smaller. We knew that we wanted it to be a large community feeling environment, but we knew that we needed to imply a lot of that, and also we just hadn't landed on the scale yet. We never would have imagined that we would have had.
Non fa tanto per me, però è veramente prezioso.
Character states, discrete character states
la qualità si vede
proprio across all 3 acts, which is a lot, and not all of them have as many like facial animation states or outfit states, or they're not as bespoke, but that still is a lot of things to set up. But at the very beginning, who we knew for sure was we'd have a handful of farmers, a handful of villagers, and then the Benedictines up in Kyrsa. And so how far can we push the realism here of like what the shapes of the habits would be?
No, siamo partiti in quarto col documentario perché è un po' lungo. No, l'ho giocato un'oretta, è veramente poco. Il gioco non dovrebbe essere lunghissimo, però l'ho giocato poco.
Working on the monks
giusto per averne un po' di esperienza.
First kind of helped figure out like this is going to be the most challenging group. Now we can move on to the villagers where we have a little bit more clothing diversity and things. But then I also found right away that the hats were going to be super important because that's the kind of thing that you can play with the head shape. So Marin's headgear was, you know, made exaggerated or made very specific colors depending on their family, which is a goofy thing that was just supposed to be subconscious association. Like it just because you're all in the baking family doesn't mean you'd all be wearing yellow clothing. But we did that just to try to help you remember association between characters because there was so many.
La diversità di fonti e diversi sì, ci sono. Il gioco non ti fa dire oh mio Dio c'è veramente un sacco di roba, però se guardate è pieno di dettagli, è pieno di cose fatte con assoluta intenzione.
And he was like, oh yeah, of course, all their hats
il gioco non è lungo,
have to come off.
Gli atti sono 3, tra uno e l'altro succede il delirio. Ok.
And so I was like, do they really? Can we forgo that little historical accuracy bit? And he was like, no, they definitely do. So then we had to design them with their hats off, which was challenging again to try to make them still feel like themselves, even though we kind of incorporated that into their designs. I think especially too, when they grow between acts and making them readable as the same person. Like,
la serie di Fallout non ho ancora iniziata, ma la inizierò probabilmente questa sera barra notte stessa. Il fantasy generalmente è una cosa che mi lascia un po' il dubbio di Pentiment, certi sono veramente scomodi da leggere secondo me. Questo può essere, sì.
The same person, even though they maybe had dramatically changed since they first saw them, which was a lot of just like finding some specific feature to incorporate into their design, whether it be like a specific mole and birthmark on their face, or just kind of always leaving their eye and nose facial proportions the same, regardless of what else you kind of change
sta ragazza, è veramente molto analitica.
That was a very fun challenge, and I think we ended up, you know, we have the narrative context to help support that as well, but I think people like that gratifying
c'è l'opzione per averlo semplificato, ottimo, bene che l'abbiano pensato, guardate un po'.
They're different now.
The first approach was the prototype was set in the Abbey only. It was actually about the murder of Brother Guy. I said, that's not what it's going to be in the end. I want someone else to be the murder victim. But I said, whatever structure we choose for quests and stories here, I want to throw it out because it's a prototype and I don't want to get too attached to anything we do here. The only thing that we did keep actually from that, although I reworked it heavily, is the sequence with Sister Illuminata where you go into the books and walk around in the books. So that aspect of the prototype we kept, and a few pieces of background art, but we refactored them heavily. And of course, in the final story, it's not about Brother Guy being murdered, but that was really the prototype, and it was, you kind of were just thrown into it without much explanation, said, here's a murder, Andreas, figure it out. And then at the end of it, the Archdeacon showed up, and you kind of explained that, and we played through that and talked about, like,
si capisce che è pensato, cioè che è realizzato con tanta cura, cioè l'estetica è veramente importantissima. E anche guardate le animazioni, per quanto minimali, quanto sono
I don't think there was anything that really
a loro
stumped us for a super long time. I think there were things that we were trying that didn't necessarily work out, but we discovered pretty quickly they didn't work out. Something that we had really early on was, this concept of having an alibi, having a weapon, having a motive. And we kind of thought about how can we make that really interesting in the aspect of walking around, talking to people, and finding all of this stuff. And our early prototypes actually basically required that you find a lot of these bits before you're really able to strongly accuse somebody. And we found that some of those bits are much more interesting than others. So obviously motive is exciting, and getting to talk to people and as a player thinking about why they would want to kill somebody, that's a really exciting thing. Finding a weapon is useful, but isn't necessarily as big of a tie-in, and maybe should be less of a requirement. So that's all stuff that we kind of had to trip through with our early prototypes and see what felt good to actually gossip with the town about and like kind of investigate and things like that. Some of those things became a little bit more sidebarred as we developed, and some got lifted up as the main thing that you were kind of looking for. I think like really early on, because it was mostly just people messing around, coming up with ideas, kind of testing things, doing concepts, it was just kind of organizing that and getting it into a space where we could maybe start making something. We did a pretty good job of not really like pursuing a final version of any of the art assets or any of that until we were really comfortable with the scenes and how they played out. We did know basically day one that the game was going to take place in a monastery and the town nearby. Knowing that, we spent a lot of time really early on. Josh kind of drew out the map of what he wanted the town to kind of look like and the monastery to kind of look like. The layouts of the scenes themselves shifted a lot more, where we would place things here, we'd have walkways over here, and then we'd be like, it's confusing to run into this before this, and so we'd shift those around. We were told the scenes from Josh when he laid out the town that we wanted. We built out all those scenes. I actually built them. They were just a piece of parchment paper as the background of the scene, and I wrote the name of the scene. It would be like kitchen, and then there would be a big line across the bottom that was bright red that you could walk on. And then I would place the characters in the scene, which they all looked the same. One of our characters, Father Gerna, was kind of the default character in the game that we had programmed him in as that. And so every character was him. And so we just turned him bright pink so that you knew that was temporary. And then we wrote the name of the real character on him. So these people would walk around with like Piero, but it was like a pink, this guy, and we'd place those in the scene, and then you could walk up and talk to them, and the dialogue all triggered, and you could see what it felt like to kind of interact with those characters in the scene, walk to the next scene, see how many scenes away it was. And that kind of really gave us a decent feel of what the whole game was going to feel like. Once we started to get confidence in the storylines and things like that, we started to be able to build like, okay, well, we're definitely using these characters, let's make the art for them. We're definitely using these scenes, let's make the art for those. Then future acts of the game really are just later versions of those scenes. So we were able to do things like, oh, now this scene needs to exist in the fall. Well, let's knock the leaves off the trees, change the colors, make the buildings look maybe like they need to be swept up a little bit, and then, then we need to show it in winter. Well, let's bring some snow in here. And it was really just kind of an evolution of previous stuff. We spent a lot of time in our vertical slice building the whole first act of the game. So once we got that really good, we were like, cool, Act 2 and 3, breeze. The acts definitely the first one took probably 2 to 3 times as long as the second one, and the second one took 2 to 3 times as long as the third one, and it just it got a lot smoother as we went.
I picked the time and the general place because it's what I know best. I only have a bachelor's degree, so it's not like I have a PhD or something, or I'm a professor, but it is the area and the time that I know best, early modern Europe, specifically the Holy Roman Empire. I've traveled to Germany and spent a lot of time there. My grandmother was born in Bavaria, and so I kind of had an affinity for that general area. But then the more I thought about the setting, and I thought about what Umberto Eco did with The Name of the Rose, which is set it at a fictional, in his case, nameless abbey in, I think it's Piedmont. By doing something fictional that is framed within historical events, it gave me a lot more freedom. I'm actually very happy about the fact that Bavarians have played the game, and they're like, where is Tassing? Like Kearsarge, this seems familiar, and it's because I actually lifted specific elements from a dozen communities, religious communities or secular communities usually in Upper Bavaria, but sometimes just more broadly in southern Germany or even in Austria. Whether it was like St. Moritz is their patron saint, or there's an abbey built on top of a Roman fort, or there was a double abbey, or there's a legend about a well or a spring. And these are all things that are present in communities, but not all of them together. And so by creating tassing in this location where it's in the mountains, and it's near the border with Austria, and it's not
ragazzi,
on the road,
me l'avete chiesto in tanti, la serie di Fallout la vedrò molto presto, probabilmente stanotte
all these things, it created this sort of ideal location to tell the specific story that I wanted to tell without being burdened by, like, well, this isn't really like what happened in Tots. This isn't
Infatti
really
si
like
vede
what
come sta
happened
parlando,
in
mio Dio.
Innsbruck, because it's not a real place. It feels like it's a real place,
assoluta consapevolezza e scelta
I
hanno fatto
thought pretty
ogni
early on
singolo
that I wanted to have
aspetto del
quite a
gioco.
large cast. I've told this anecdote before, but I was watching
Molto carino lo
a
studio
film
storico
called
che c'è dietro, in effetti è divertente, aveva messo qualche dubbio che è già
examining the procession to
sono
Calvary
sorpreso, è anche più di quanto immaginassi.
the Elder. And it's this beautiful Mannerist painting showing hundreds of people in this valley and Christ crucified sort of like in this inconspicuous spot, which is a very Mannerist thing to do. And there's just so many people from all these different strata of society. And then there is a mill in the background, and this mill is towering on this impossibly tall cliff. And in the film adaptation, Rutger Hauer actually plays the artist, and he says at one point, my painting needs to be big enough to hold everything, everyone, all the people. And I was like, that's awesome. And he described the idea of God as the miller watching over the world. And so there's a couple of things that I pulled from that. One is actually the mill, which is something we addressed in the story, but the idea of the miller sort of like looming over the town, almost at the level of the abbot, this kind of hated figure. But then I said, no, it's important in this story that it holds charcoal burners and printmakers and bakers and artists and nobles and all these people, and also to show different perspectives on, for example, vocation, being called to monastic life. And for some people, it's something that they take very seriously, and others, it's grudging, and for some people, it's sort of an opportunity. People came to that life and still come to that life from all different places, and their experiences in it are very different. And I didn't want to try to portray any individual occupation or strata as this is what everyone here is like. There are some pretty decent and nice nobles, and there are some pretty awful nobles, and there are some monks and nuns that are very pious and some that aren't. So it was kind of to give that breadth of experience. Thinking back to it, I want to say that Klaus Drucker was the first person, because I knew I wanted a printing press to be kind of an important central feature of this town. Would there have been a printing press in a town in the Alps? It's my town, I can kind of say whatever. And, they kind of explain, well, there are Italians coming through and we print things for them and all these travelers, and there are people going to the shrine, so we can print for them. And then I knew there would be a parish priest, a town priest, because yes, there are the monks and the nuns, but they're separate, they have a cloistered life. And then I think I had the idea for Sister Amelie being attached in her cell, attached to the church. And then after that, I think I started to develop a few other things. I talked to Winston Black, one of our consultants, actually went to school with him, although he went on to actually become an academic. But his specialty is in medieval medicine, so I worked with him on the idea of the town doctor and his relationship to the midwife. So I knew that I wanted a midwife, I wanted a town doctor who's actually university educated, and then the peasantry. And we really built out the peasantry. I said they should be the most numerous because they were the most numerous. It takes a lot of work to get all that food made. And I wanted to really distinguish those farming families, but also show that in a lot of ways they are interconnected. There are marriages between them, there are marriages sort of between those classes. So I knew I wanted a lot of the peasantry because I did think, again, to show the breadth of experience and intelligence and attitude. There are some peasants that are truly awful, and there are some that are extremely kind and nice and hardworking and intelligent because they're just people. And I think it kind of just went out organically from that until I kind of looked at this map. I think very visually. I think of characters in terms of kind of like a name and an image in my mind. And then I start building traits around that, and then I start working them into story elements. That's how I naturally do it, and it's also, I was interested to find out that when Umberto Eco started The Name of the Rose, he started with just a list of names of monks and their positions, but that's kind of just how I thought about it, and then I thought about them kind of in the town and where they would all live and how they would be arranged around the commons. And that's kind of how I just thought about it. And for a long time, a lot of the story doc, other than the most bare bones elements of it, was just a list of characters, names, a very, very brief description, their age and kind of general appearance, and then like a sentence or two about like, this is their deal. And it was kind of about getting that spread of contrast. So when you read through it, you started to get a sense of, yeah, this is a whole community of people who are quite different and quite varied. Yeah, I think that was kind of the process. It was pretty organic.
If you're finding this documentary interesting so far, we just wanted to let you know that we have extended cuts of some of the interviews, along with some bonus patron-exclusive scenes available over on our Patreon. That's patreon.com/NoClip. Pentiment is a game entirely focused on people, their motives, relationships, and what role they occupy in the town. But creating a cast of memorable characters isn't easy when there's just so many of them. So how did the team populate the town of Tassing and the adjoining abbey? And what about the character of the town itself?
The characters that were only featured once or like in their own specific context were really fun to work on as well, because it was interesting trying to give justice to their story and draw attention to them, even though they might only have their couple small moments. For all of the Memory Palace characters were really fun, because those were getting to push the limits of what we wanted to do for character designs, like do the really ornate kind of. That was a fun one as far as having historical vetting and notes given on the project. I had given all of them sort of the rings around their heads, the halos in the first one, of sort of like, these are holy figures and they're imaginary, so this might be appropriate in the setting. And it was kind of a very strong reaction of like, well, in all Catholic portrayals, like literally the only people that have those are saints, so it should only be saints. And then it was funny because it was like, well, I guess Grobian gets to keep this, and he's like the awful one, but he's the only one that's actually at sainthood status in this whole lineup. So we made that adjustment. It was like, okay, well, this one is a philosopher and this one's a king and that one's a saint, I guess.
So che siete in hype per Kingdom Deliverance, io no, perché non è decisamente di mio gusto, però è stato estremamente apprezzato, anche se all'inizio ho avuto un sacco di casini. Probabilmente questo ne avrà molte meno, dato che hanno avuto l'esperienza del primo e ora hanno anche i soldini e tutto il workflow.
Places that have physical pieces of historical textiles and things that still exist here, like textiles in general just don't hold up in the same way that architecture does. So I think architecture references were a lot easier to find examples of, because buildings from that time period from all across Europe still are standing. You can kind of look at them and backwards engineer what the materials were maybe made out of. And with fashion, that was a lot more difficult, because I think what mostly has remained is clothing of extreme nobility, or like very specific religious clothing and things, the pieces of history that people deemed important enough to try to preserve at a time where commoners' clothes just really didn't exist. So that was where we needed to get a bit more flexible as far as where we were pulling the visual references from. There were paintings and stuff that were from a very similar time period, but Flemish, or slightly outside of the region that we were at, or German paintings that were a little bit before and after the historical setting that I would look at and think, okay, with the amount of stylization we're doing with our characters, if we kind of take some creative liberties here and assume what they would be doing would be somewhere between here and here, then
non pensavo si fossero spinti fino a questo punto
there aren't
su questo numero di
period,
cose.
so you really only have the reference art. And when we're talking about woodcuts and stuff, a lot of those aren't necessarily realism. It was how they drew the clothing at the time. So then it would be, well, we can just copy that too. Like, maybe this isn't necessarily exactly how the garments were structured, but it's how people portrayed the garments to be structured, and that's close enough.
Mo vediamo come funzionano le cose adesso.
When it comes to like the colors of the clothing, that was something where we really did focus on the range of pigments being used in the woodcuts, more so than the type of pigments that would have existed for dyeing clothing, because that gave us a nice limited palette of kind of like, here's our reds, here's our blues, here's our greens, yellows. We really wouldn't get many of these color ranges, so when we play with what color people's clothing can be, it should stay within this range, because that's what people were using in the art.
Il Turk, ciao, buonasera.
Andreas was always the main character. I don't know if I had a fully formed idea of who he was initially. I wanted someone who felt like they could move between the ecclesiastical world and the secular world. And I talked somewhat, this is maybe some of the most implausible stuff in the story, but I talked with Christopher de Hamel about the idea of a professional artist working within a religious community. And he said pretty bluntly, like, pretty much all monastic scriptoria were like gone by this point in time. It wouldn't be impossible for one to still be working, but it would totally be on the way out. So that became then a plot point where everyone is like, how is Kearsaw's scriptorium still open? And it was explained that, like, yeah, this is an anomaly, this is an anachronism. And the idea of Andreas as this artist on his Wanderjahre, where he's in his journeyman years, he's preparing to become a master, but he's traveling around Europe and learning from masters and making some money. And this is sort of his last stop before he goes back to Nuremberg and gets married. And so there are some things where he would probably have to adopt a habit when he was inside, but we hand wave that because it would be a little clunky. But yeah, I mean, secular people would and do work in religious institutions in this way because sometimes they just don't have the people who are actually part of the community. So Andreas sort of lodging with the peasants and then literally traveling all the way through the town to go over into the abbey gave us an excuse to have this guy who's literally traveling between both worlds by foot, which I thought worked out very well. Another inspiration for the story of the game and the structure of the game, other than Name of the Rose, is Andrei Rublev, which is a Russian film made in, I think, 1966 by Tarkovsky. And it is about a 15th century Russian icon painter. So it's an actual historical figure, but the story they tell is complete fiction. So it starts with the artist as a young man, and then he goes through witnessing all of these horrible things that happen, and then it just spans this long period of time, and it's like a 3.5-hour movie. In typical Tarkovsky fashion, it's like really slow and really like intense. So I liked this idea of focusing on one community and following one character with all the people in that community over a long period of time. I was in college in the mid-90s, and at that time, a lot of the focus was on microhistory and social history. And so it was more about learning about the day-to-day lives of people, and often not super fancy people. I felt like using the Reformation and using the Revolution of 1525 as sort of a setting and a context was good and important, and it would inform people's thinking. Obviously, it's going to matter more to certain people than others. It kind of gets away from the great men of history, which, don't get me wrong, I actually think there's a ton of things to learn about kings and generals and pharaohs, but there is also a great benefit in understanding day-to-day lives of people. And because people don't really know this period super well, I wanted to show more day-to-day life and also show kind of, hey, here are people that are in a society that is interconnected. And so they're not cut off from, like, the Reformation is not really happening right here, but people travel and people talk. And so the abbot is aware of who Martin Luther is, and most of the monks are aware of who Martin Luther is. So when the Baron starts talking about it, they, even if they don't really know the details, they're kind of like, I know we're not really supposed to be talking about this. And then the German Peasant War, because it was a popular revolt because the conditions people lived under were getting worse, kind of all over the place. And even though it really happened very little in Bavaria, it was almost entirely within what is now Baden-Württemberg, Swabia, basically, there were still knock-on effects because people's living conditions were not that dissimilar. With pamphlets getting distributed and people can read, then people are like, oh, I'm this makes sense to me. Yeah, I think we maybe should be upset about what's going on and how our taxes have been getting worse and how there's less to eat. And so I wanted to use that as a backdrop, but not have it focus on, well, the Duke of Bavaria did this, and we're going to follow him on his campaign to crush peasant revolts within Bavaria, because that's a very different type of story.
The most interesting tidbit that I learned would be how people walk. That was an interesting one that I had to learn, because I'm like, I didn't think about it. I'm like, I got shoes. I don't have to worry about it. But people back then, like, they didn't have, like, you know, rubber-soled shoes. They had, like, leather shoes with no soles, really. The only thing they had is, like, something just to barely protect their feet. Josh showed me. He was just like, by the way, people don't walk with heel first, they walk with the ball of their foot first. And so I actually did a deep dive on that. I'm like, oh, they walked with the ball of their foot first because if they walked with their heel and they stepped on like a sharp rock or a sharp like object, then they put something through their foot, and that's potentially very deadly. So, or they can just not work for a while and then their family goes hungry. So they had to step with the ball of their foot first, as he's doing, to ensure that whatever they step on, they don't step fully on. So it's more of like an investigation method before they step fully, put their whole body weight on it to make sure what they're stepping is safe. Them to line up correctly. Like, I love
oggi battani Menor con tutti gli obiettivi che io non ho giocato.
And then the
Buonasera a tutti, soprattutto a Kristal Cross. Grazie mille, grazie mille.
Bump, there we go. The main thing that I look at when trying to find an animation style for a game is like, what in my mind would look good for this style of game. I looked at it, the art style it's older, the style of the characters, like, you know, how flat they look. They really don't have perspective to them because the illuminated manuscripts really didn't do very great perspective, nor did they do like great anatomy. Hannah did a great job actually adding anatomy back to some of the characters to make sure that they actually work for our character rigs. So when I looked at them, I'm like, obviously fully animated wouldn't really work well. If we did it full spline, like every frame per second, that would have looked really awkward. It would have made it look really fluid. It would have made it look really choppy. The animation style that I opted for, that I actually played around with to get there, was limited animation, but also doing more of exaggerated animation. The limited animation helped sell the art style, so it looked like it fit, it felt like it fit, it didn't look awkward, and then the exaggerated animation helped sell, one, the character, and then also helped sell also the art style. In terms of trying to find the animation style, basically all it was just me. I think it was just me and Hannah in a room for a long time.
Lo so.
And then we ended up doing, basically, it's like animating on like 4s is an animation term. Instead of animating on 1s or 2s, we're animating on 4s. If we did fully traditional animation, I would have needed a whole lot of more animators and a whole lot of more money.
When we started getting into like facial animations and stuff, we definitely had a lot to figure out as far as how far to push them, because we had this challenge of like, one of our pieces of reference material was definitely Night in the Woods and looking at how they manage setting up their scene structure and conversations. But with that game, they have very simplified and stylized characters that have huge eyeballs, which is really great for making emotions read from a distance that's like looking at it from scene size and not being in a conversation view. And we realized that with the art style we were doing, we don't have as much real estate for kind of expressing with the eyes in that way. So then we knew, well, this is why in animation things are often exaggerated and stylized, because you want to be able to see it within the scene and have the emotions read really well, but we also didn't want it to feel goofy, so we had to do a lot of kind of experimenting on, like, I think Andreas had like 4 or 5 different waves of facial animation or facial expression states until we got that just right. Like his surprise face for a while was like very surprised. Finding the balance of stuff that would read in context and feel good and not feel like we were being
è molto al di là di quello che immaginavo.
Yeah, silly or not consistent with the mood that we were trying to set in the story.
So when we were making the characters, when I was rigging up Andreas initially, I wanted to be able to do anything that I wanted to do on one of our like 3D games. I didn't want to stunt our animation capabilities by having a limited rig. So I created pretty much a detailed rig that can do anything that Josh wanted under the sun. The character wanted to do a cartwheel, we could do a cartwheel. The rig can handle that. The only caveat is that we had to then draw more art assets for like the actual character themselves. So like if we wanted to have them do a cartwheel, we made sure that they had the poses so they could do the cartwheel, like for example on the torso. There's only so much mesh animation we could do on the torso. We would have to do like, you know, a new art piece. The amount of bones that the character has are pretty simple in terms of points of articulation. The magic really comes in when you do the actual like mesh animation. So for example, the 2.5D face gave us a lot of freedom to make the characters look around and feel more alive and give more like acting nuances to a scene rather than kind of like having a character going, we were able to add more acting choices, like
una cosa come questa anche
and then same with,
fatta con
like,
estrema cura e molto
like,
dettagliata
skirts,
è possibile con un team più piccolino, ma perché hanno fatto certe scelte.
Basically put vertex points all around the art, like for example the torso, so there'll be a bunch of vertex points around that. We skinned it to the bones, so when the bones moved or if we needed the character to kind of turn, the torso would like deform with that turn.
Nico.
To make scenes feel alive, there were a couple things that we had to do. So for the VFX, we didn't want to do any kind of real-time, I guess, particles. We didn't want to do like realistic looking cards. So what we ended up doing was I looked at the art style that Hannah had already established. Then I looked at the touchstone art that Josh has already made for the game. And then I kind of combined all of those references to make the actual VFX style that we wanted to achieve for the game, because obviously if we use something realistic, it wouldn't work. If we use something that was fully animated at 30 frames per second, wouldn't really work because the limited art style of the characters, so we did a really limited stylized VFX for the game. Even the particles that we did for, like, for example, the fire, if you look at them, they're not just standard particles. They're like, if you zoom in on them, they actually have they have symbols and stuff that are going on and flutter through them. So it's a really cool, nice little detail that we added. So to make your game feel alive, we had to do a lot of compiling of different elements, and that was, having characters have jobs, doing random things around the environments. We did a lot of creature work so we can make sure that, we sold the rural aspect of it and making it feel alive, and that we were in a rural area, a farm area, out in the middle of nowhere, not a town. And then we also did a lot of VFX work. Even though the VFX work, a lot of people probably didn't notice, but it was more of a subconscious feeling, giving the feeling that, we're in an old house, we're by, a pig stall, so there are all the flies and things like that. So we did a lot of subconscious VFX work to sell some life happening in our scenes.
Quanto sono bravi tutti, nel senso
Pentiment had a
veramente
setting and
si
was populated
esprimono
by a cast of characters.
una
But
maniera
how is this
e
game
con un
going to play? With no
esprimono un
combat, perfunctory
dettaglio
movement,
e
and
una
quite a
cura
lot
e
of
un amore
reading,
per quello che
Pentiment
fanno
could easily have been a slog
impressionante.
to get through. So how did the team write a story to pull the player along? And what game mechanics were utilized to vary up the experience?
One of the things that we like to do at Obsidian is have choice and consequence and reactivity. The problem is that usually you're a wandering stranger, so that reactivity has to happen kind of immediately or in a very short term, or you have to kind of throw that character back into the player's face somewhere way down the road so they can understand, oh, this is how my choice impacted you. But the appeal of staying in Kearsarge and Tassing for 25 years is that we could keep coming back and saying, hey, remember that thing you did? This is still going. And it made it a lot more appealing to carry knock-on effects where you don't initially realize it, but then later you see oh man, that's right, I did do that. That is having a consequence. And so that was really appealing to me. So the idea of the artist and the idea of taking place in that community over a long period of time was sort of always really central to the idea of the game. I tried to structure the pacing of the story in such a way where you meet a lot of characters, but we space that out over time. And a lot of that is so that you see the murder victim interact with a bunch of people that clearly hate his guts. And you're and then later when he gets murdered, you're oh yeah, I remember when everyone was hating on this guy. Maybe that's, I should look into that. So we try to introduce really distinctive characters and memorable things, meter them out over time. Character creation, we actually have take place over a number of scenes. We tried to make it not front-loaded, not like a traditional sort of RPG. So it just happens through conversation, because you're only defining about 5 or 6 things really up front. Hopefully that can pull the player through all the way until they start seeing more and new and interesting things and getting them involved in some sort of dramatic tension. We introduce Ferenc as this kind of mysterious guy who's rushing in and writing something in the book and slamming it, going through the books with Illuminata. These are all things to kind of make the player, even something as simple as, we actually added this in the first patch, which is the horseshoe minigame for Endris. And it was kind of to tell people, there's not just reading in the game. And granted, those mini games are all very, very simple. And again, we were inspired by Night in the Woods, and I talked to Scott Benson about that. And it's kind of just to give the players another way to look at the world and like a little fun thing to do. We just try to break things up so the player doesn't feel like, man, I've just been walking and talking to people. There's always going to be something like a stick breaking mini game, a cookie cutting mini game, like whatever that is. You know, there's a card game. That card game is probably the most expensive of them. But there's always something to kind of keep things fresh and keep things moving forward. And then over the acts, there were things where I knew, I said, if yes, we have the seasons change, and that is really nice to see, but we want to hold some things back so that the player in each act, even though they're just in the confines of this community for the entire game, they are going to see new things. So in Act 2, you're going to see the aqueduct. You know, in Act 3, you actually get to see the inside of the convent, which has been off limits to you for the first 2 acts. So we always try to have some new reveal and new thing, and especially going act to act when there's a big time jump, because I've seen this from a ton of players where they get to the end of Act 1 and they're like, oh, that was a pretty cool little game. And then they're like, oh, wait a minute, like 7 years, I'm still here? What's going on? Oh my God. Okay, wait, okay, let's see what's going on. Yeah, just the thought process was, show the player some interesting things, not to give them a false expectation, but to say there's variety here. There is something that's going to keep your attention. But if you don't like reading, and if you don't like this art style, you aren't going to like the game, and that's okay. That is absolutely okay. And that's actually one of the reasons why I think on Game Pass, that's totally fine. Because if people dive in, they're like, let's check this out. Nope, see ya. Like, that's fine. But for some people, it's really their thing, and it's going to hook them. I feel like by the time you get to the end of the first day, I think most players who are into the concept of the game, they start to feel a sense of who Andreas is. They start to feel some attachment to the characters in the Abbey, the peasants, and they just want to keep seeing how that develops. They know there are conflicts there. They want to see where things go. And I think it works pretty well. I think one of the more frustrating things about working on games like this is it's really satisfying when people have the illusion works very well, and they see the things that are absolutely firing and are absolutely reactive, and they imagine more than there is. It just kind of creates, because it's about the experience. It's not actually about the tearing down individual things. But then there are some players where they make choices and there are consequences, but they don't notice them. And they make other choices expecting there to be consequences and there aren't. And then their conclusion is, this game has no reactivity. So one of the things that we did do, which, I mean, honestly, we just pulled it from Disco Elysium, we adapted it to our own purposes, but it's those small choices and the little reactivity that plays into the mechanism of how, you know, when you try to convince something or persuade someone of something, how that works. So we try to introduce that very early on. Seemingly minor things that you say or do to people are going to get tracked. And at some point when you try to convince someone of something, for example, Martin, just trying to get him to greet you in a friendly manner, you know, which is harder than it might seem, those things will be tracked and it will be checked and you'll succeed or you'll fail. There's nothing random about it. It's an aggregation of these little choices that you make. So that's very important for establishing the stakes for the player, because we're saying, hey, when you're in a seemingly innocuous conversation, actually think about what you're saying, because even something very small can have an impact. So like one of the things that we introduce also is with Ava and Otto, because you can flirt with Ava, and we track that. And at the end of Act 1, Otto is like, if you're really flirting, he's like, yeah, basically don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. Like, don't, like, I'm not sad to see you go because you're trying to hit on my future wife. And then when you come back in Act 2, he's like, oh, you come back to try to steal my wife again? And, you know, so some of those things we try to build up sort of organically over time, and then there are the bigger things. And honestly, I would say some of those are planned early, and some of them evolve organically. And some of them happen, actually some of them happen quite late, where we felt like, man, this character is around a long time, and it doesn't really feel like there's anything that you can really do to shape how they work. And so Ursula was actually one of those. Ursula's little reactivity chain was developed pretty late in the process, because she's I think 2 years old when she's the first real world character you encounter. She's poking your foot, and so I had this idea of, because she has her father who is pretty straightforward, he's a religious man, and then her grandfather is really into like the old pagan stuff. and you have a neighbor who's Attilia, who's also into that stuff. And I'm like, well, okay, so we know that ill Peter can die at the end of Act 1. Yeah, it's if you don't actually get the money for the Gertner's taxes, ill Peter will die at the end of Act 1, and that's something where if it happens, most players they don't realize that it's I mean, we bring it up and it is explicit. We say that, but some people might not go like, oh crap, I never paid the taxes, and that's why ill Peter died. And then Attilia can die, of course, at the end of Act 1. And you tell that story to Ursula, where she wakes up in the middle of the night, and you can tell her a story. And either you can tell her a fantasy story based on some place that Andreas has traveled to, or you can kind of be grumpy and say, like, let me tell you about the little girl who wouldn't let an artist sleep. And that's kind of either grounding her, kind of saying, like, quit being interested in fantasy, or entertaining her sort of fantastic notions. And then in Act 2, when you meet her again, she asks you about your travels. And again, you can say, well, yeah, you know, I was in Paris and blah, blah, blah. And she'll say, no, I don't like, not the boring stuff. Like, tell me something cool. And you can say like, there's nothing cool. Or you can say like, well, you know, I heard a siren on the River Seine or whatever. And it's the White Lady. And, you know, she'll freak out. But those things are being tracked. And then she asks you like, do you think I should listen to my grandpa and listen to Attilia? Now, if they're dead, that doesn't even come up. But if they're alive, you can either encourage it or you can say like, you know what, you might get in trouble for that. But that actually has consequences then in Act 3 when you talk to her, because she either started learning things about the pagan ways and the origins of the village, or she didn't. And then after the end of the game, there can even be consequences for that. But most of that stuff was developed pretty late in the process. So some of it is thought out from the beginning. Some of it comes up when we're working on the act. And then some of the stuff toward the end, we just said like, there feels like there's sort of an emptiness here where with not a whole lot of work, we could get something that builds over time and gets more reactivity. And so some people see that stuff and they're like, oh my God, that's so cool. And they imagine even more things that are reactive, but then other people make choices and they expect there to be reactivity.
Turno Maranda 25 tutti ripetitivi, sostanzialmente Ni a Toppino puoi giocarlo in due mondi. Sono felice la batte dandogli conto, gli altri sono uguali, quindi a volte devi non è rigiocabile. Ok,
terminology in
diciamo
places that are probably unfamiliar to most of us. So careful consideration went into building Pentiment as an experience that anyone could enjoy. The puzzle of trying to properly communicate these concepts in a way that felt part of the game's aesthetic and didn't interrupt exposition was a tricky one. And while we're exploring that, let's also talk about the font. Font designers Lettermatic helped on this project, and they've produced a fantastic case study of their work to design Pentiment's various fonts on their website. We have a link to it in the description. But how did the team implement this cursive script into the game? What about all those fancy lads in the margins?
Well, there were a few people who didn't know what an abbot was. So someone said like, well, should we have a glossary entry for abbot? And I was like, well, okay, are we going to have a glossary entry for every office of the abbey? And then someone brought up, should we have a glossary entry for Jesus Christ? Because this isn't just going to be played by people who come from places with a Christian tradition. I was like, man, I understand what you're saying and it's totally valid, but I think that we're going to have like 1 million underlines in every conversation. And, you know, it was kind of arbitrary, I will say, but anything that I thought that you would be able to figure out through repeated exposure and context, like abbot, I said, if you don't know what an abbot is and you keep talking to this guy who's in charge of the abbey, clearly, demonstrably, you're going to figure out, oh, he's the head of the abbey. So anything that was like a really proper term, like Martin Luther, you know, most people probably know that name. They may know that he's associated with Christianity in some form, but actually a lot of people don't know what the Reformation is. They don't know that, oh, Lutheran, that guy, he's the guy behind Lutheranism. That's why his name's Luther. There were certain things that we defined like that because it was very important to understanding the context. I actually think that the limited space in the margins worked in everyone's favor because I couldn't blab on and on about an individual thing. I just had to be like, okay, what does the player really need to know for the historical context? This is not Wikipedia. If they want to go and watch a YouTube video or dig into Wikipedia, that's awesome. That's what I did when I played Darklands, and I went into the bibliography, and I was like, oh, I can read more about this stuff. That's a desired expectation, but it's not necessary for playing the game.
We did also have the opportunity to, early on in development, we went to the Getty Museum, and they had a illuminated manuscript exhibit there. And I had seen some examples in person, but not an entire collection that was like dedicated to just illuminated manuscripts from that time period. So these were, again, kind of earlier of like 12th to 14th century ones, the very gilded, painted looking ones. But that's when it really clicked for me as far as seeing a lot of those stylized, goofy cartoons from history, where I knew some of it was just stylistic preference and them painting them that way because they were supposed to be silly or supposed to be expressive, and that was the standard of the time. But when I saw them in person, I was shocked by how small lots of these books were, and the fact that the illustrations are like this big. So it's like, yeah, you paint a realistic face that's 3/4 of an inch tall, like a portrait of 5 people. Like some of it was just the limitation of the media, and because
puoi accusare persone diverse, soprattutto lo scopo è trovare l'assassino del barone. Ma cosa significa che non c'è un colpevole giusto o sbagliato e qui entra in gioco l'effetto della tua scelta?
Drawings and all of it onto books that could fit in your pocket. And so that was the thing that just didn't really connect
Prima la pensavo
to me
una cosa più
as a
radicale con
modern artist.
diramazioni,
Like I know that
poi
they're
invece l'ho
small,
sottovalutata come
but when
cosa,
you
adesso
see it and then
piano piano
connect,
sto iniziando a
like,
capire.
this is why they were making them in this way, was because of that being a limitation, or because just the nature of what they were working with and working on. Like they were using feather quills and doing these things by candlelight, and it's like what I would need a magnifying glass and like 3 LED lights pointed at it to be able to see it. So that part was really amazing to think of the craft and the skills required to actually work with the media that they were working with. Starting out, we knew
I rumori anche sono molto curati, questo me lo ricordo molto bene. È una delle cose che mi ha sorpreso di più. Sembra piccola come cosa, ma in realtà è importantissima, perché mi sa che la sentirebbe tipo tutto il gioco.
Historical spellings, just because if not in this game, then when? All of that was really cool, and thinking of the whole dynamics of having the typeface shift depending on the context and the person that was speaking. So working through exactly, we knew we wanted the monastic kind of black letter heavy scripts, and then also have the townspeople scripts, but then there was still a dissonance, like people would see the more casual script and it still felt fancy to a modern viewer, because again, it's very structured, very elegant type of cursive, even though that was the more casual writing style of the time. So then we knew we wanted to have an additional typeface at one point that would be essentially peasant scripts. I think at the beginning we kind of knew we wanted at least 3 fonts, and as we would use those in context, we'd realize that we might need another one for this specific use case. And then the thread puller font ended up being unique because we wanted to have that be a part of the narrative context of finding the notes, was that, oh, you can tell this isn't from one of the monks in the monastery because it's more ornate than that. And then when we got into things like the errors, that was another thing that we kind of thought would be cool as a tool for differentiating different scribe levels, essentially how comfortable people were with writing. I think at first it was kind of just wouldn't it be neat, like Josh had that idea about the intro of the game being very physical and like you're the person scraping the page and stuff to kind of get the viewer into the space of thinking about the physical media of it. And so I think that was another idea of kind of, it would make it feel like there was a person writing this down as the game was playing. And so that was the goal initially. And then we were like, we could also use this to then again contrast different types of people from different backgrounds.
Tutto questo studio e questo lavoro per un gioco che se non fosse stato su Game Pass probabilmente molta poca utenza avrebbe anche solo pensato di comprare. Questo è un discorso interessante da fare.
Sì. And then the Druckers doing the wood pressing
part. Yeah. Yes, that one was so cool when Josh kind of explained what he wanted there and how it might work, and then again our programmer Brett did the first test and we were like, yeah, that's so cool. It feels weird. The first test we did, it was doing that pressing every single statement that people would say, and it was like and it got, again, that was just like, well, that's annoying, so we're gonna have to change that. But then it became the first line in sort of a series of threads back and forth between people is when we would use that. And I think the first time it happens is very cheeky. Like people are like, "Whoo, what was that?" And then you immediately are like, "Oh, yes, of course." And having the flipped like metal character, yeah, that was a fun inclusion. I'm very glad we got to do that.
I knew this was going to be one of the biggest challenges of this project, and to be honest, it proved out to be worthwhile. But initially it was, are we sure we want to invest this much time into this feature? But it was really a keystone feature of the game, is the font system. So we had 5 different fonts that we gathered from external artists that would generate them, and then we would actually import each glyph and each character separately into a stroke mask, basically, that revealed each letter as it was being written out. Figuring out the tech behind that and making sure that it was up to snuff with what Josh was looking for was really quite a challenge. Like for a printing system, a cursive system that would simulate ink quill dippings and things like that. Right? Like this is all stuff that you kind of have to make from scratch because nobody else is going to prioritize this stuff in their font systems. Right? So yeah, a lot of time was spent on that in the development process. We experimented a lot of that throughout dev cycle, like how is a cursive going to actually work? Like computer cursive works because every glyph is the same, right? Like they know when a cursive point is going to end and then progress on to the next glyph. But when you add variations to that, like how do you ensure that that's still going to look right? So yeah, we ended up with a bunch of different like randomizations that we would kind of put into the font. To make sure that, like, hey, this E is going to be slightly different, or this A is going to have a loop on it, or it's going to be more compact, or it's going to be tilted slightly. And all those little variations all required their own individual stroke mask. So it was basically done by hand. Somebody would go in and draw over each letter to make sure that it would reveal, like, in a way that would be written. So.
What about the, I guess, accompanying audio that happens with that? Is there a lot of work to try and make sure that feels?
Yeah, I mean, we worked pretty closely with our audio engineer on the project to make sure that that was right, because we knew that we weren't going to have VO in the game, so we wanted our VO to be that audio. And they spent a lot of time with Josh to try to get the sound right, to make sure that it was going to sound like Parchment of the time period and everything. So yeah, it was really quite a challenge to kind of figure that out. We spent a lot of time with how conversations were going to work and how conversations were going to flow, right? Like we needed to know, hey, how many bubbles on screen is going to be too much? How is this bubble going to transition off the screen? And how much animation are we going to really do and have it be kind of accurate to the time period? So there's a lot of iteration and a lot of development there that may not be appreciated, but we iterated a lot throughout development on that kind of stuff. So that kind of stuff, I'm really proud of how we ended up with it. I mean, it may not be everybody's cup of tea, but we spent a lot of time just trying to make sure that how does this journal work, and how do we transition from the journal to the game in a way that's not too jarring and flows with the rest of the historical aspects of the game.
Can I ask, my notes, I have this written down as those weird little boys in the margins.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about the, what you had a name for them, what were they called? The margin.
I like weird little boys in the margins better. I think that's a better term.
Tell us about them.
I also love them. So those are marginalia, all of those kind of cartoons that happen in that space. And I find them super charming. I think lots of people find them really charming. I think it's fascinating. This is a tangent, but the team behind Inculinati, that game was kind of being developed and releasing in a very similar schedule to us. And when we caught wind of that project initially, we were like, what are the chances? This is so cool. We have 2 games that I like directly reference medieval marginalia in sort of illustration styles. Theirs is a little further back than ours, but we intentionally included some of the older styles in ours just because we thought it was fun. I find something so beautiful about these goofy little cartoons that they still resonate so strongly with people. And I think some of it, there's this impression that we're almost like dunking on them, or like they're drawn bad and that's why they're funny, and that's not the case at all. We're always drawn to be funny or to be storytelling, like communications like that. Like the margins and type of imagery that got to go in there was lots of times just the scribes and the monks that were making the illustrations having a spot of freedom that was totally their own, so they got to draw things that they wanted to in that space and that they could. And so like there's something so beautiful about that to me that I wanted to incorporate in the same way of being like, all right, this is our space to be silly, and so some stuff that we just find delightful, we want to be able to include there. If it felt goofy in the original context, like we want to make sure that that's still there. So we use the margin space as kind of our contextual, here's some additional information about specific terms that you would encounter in dialogue. And then we occasionally had some representative images of like a person. If it was reminding you of who that person was, we'd include their portrait in there as well if they were being referenced in a scene that they weren't actually in. But the rest of the stuff was just stuff that we liked and we wanted to include. And there was definitely times where I just needed a break from something else and I would draw some more goofy margin doodles that would be in there. And then another thing that I loved from the reference material is just all of the really long fingers pointing to stuff. That is the cursoring system. I just had when I first discovered the usage of those in various texts from people, that was really common to be like, oh, I'm pointing to a typo or I'm pointing to more specific information. And there'd be these fingers where like 4 of them would be going off in different directions and like interweaving in each other. It was the most absurd thing. And I'm like, this is so good. So that's when we kind of decided we wanted to use that extending cursor system, but the finger just got longer. And there are some that like reach all the way across the scene. I don't know, I think they just liked them. It was just the standard, like that was kind of, some people saw that being how it was done and started referencing each other. And I think it's just funnier than arrows, and that's probably why they were doing it. So things like that, it was like if it resonated with us and we found them really fun, that we knew that that would translate to players experiencing them as well. I loved with the marginalia because some of them we got to like design new silly things, and lots of those were essentially kind of copies of just one-for-one pieces that were in historical references, and the player base caught on to that right away. And I think it was not like a cheesy like, oh, you ripped them off. It was very much like, I know that, like they're referencing this thing and I know what that is. So the frog was one. And that one of the rocket cat is actually a medieval illustration that has a cat with a rocket strapped to its back that looks very much like that.
If you've managed to get this far without pausing the video and downloading Pentiment, now is your final warning. In this last chapter, we're going to explore the game's final act, the ending, and how the team felt when it was finally completed.
Ok, quindi questo è il punto degli spoiler, ragazzi. Quindi se non volete spoilerarvi le parti del gioco, saltate questa parte, ok?
I was inspired by Andrei Rublev, which in the third act, Andrei is not even really present for most of the act, but it focuses on a young man who is the son of a bell maker. And he convinces the Tsar's soldiers that he knows the secret of casting bells. His father has died. And he's like, I can cast a bell. And he convinces them, and he says, like, I'll show you where to cast and everything. He's young. He's like, I think 15 or something like that. And they're all incredulous. They're like, there's no way this kid knows anything. And he's secretly inside, he's like terrified because the Duke's soldiers say, if you fuck this up, we're going to kill you and the entire crew. And you've already seen in the movie like some real horrible violence against artists that like displeased the Grand Duke, I guess. I like this idea of having a younger artist who, in this case, is a woman, so there's like an extra layer of like skepticism on top of it, having to take over an art project where she is capable, but she's young and there's a lot of people doubting her, and focusing on her and making it kind of about her to shift their perspective. And that's kind of how that started. And I liked the idea of it being Klaus's daughter. And I can't remember at what time we decided that Marie and Bert, his wife and son, would die. So he's survived only by his daughter. And so I wanted that relationship to be really strong and like strengthened in Act 2 so that it would be a really solid foundation for the third act.
Did the ending change much then the last
little bit? Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, so this is spoilers. You're being warned here, but initially you did not witness Klaus die, and people were like, "This sucks." So he did die, and that was like super awful, and it kind of came out of nowhere. And there was also the conversations with Father Thomas. There was a bunch of stuff, like basically it was twice as long. And people were like, man, I know this is villain monologuing at the end, but we got to wrap this up. So I cut that out. I moved all of that into Act 2 and I trimmed it down. We spent a lot more time establishing Klaus being attacked and being sick and letting you know up front, like, no, dude, he is gonna die. Like, it's a matter of time. And then allowing you to actually be with him when it happened. And that was actually direct, like people who had had experiences with loved ones dying. and they actually felt like genuinely angry when it happened in the game. They're like, this sucks so bad, it's actually triggering experiences from my own life. Please change this. And so we did, and it was like way better. And also, yeah, Utz, there was no option to marry Utz. Because I was kind of like, I couldn't conceive it. Like I wrote a lot of Utz's stuff, and he sucks. He's 18 years old and just kind of stinks, and he's really inconsiderate. And people are like, I don't know. Some people are like, I don't know, maybe I want to. I was like, really? And they said, yeah. I said, okay, yeah, we'll put that in there. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff. And then just structurally, there were some other things that I can't remember really clearly. A lot of the time flow and things like that in Act 3 were not really clear. So we cleaned up a lot of that stuff, but it was all due to feedback that we got pretty late.
I think among the team, we were relatively confident in the project. In general, we had done some play tests with people around the studio, with some friends and family. We'd gotten feedback from them. A lot of the things that we got feedback on, we were able to address before we shipped. Because again, we weren't super crunched for time on this project. We felt pretty confident in what we were able to release in the time we had. I think also, I have to give a lot of credit to the comms team here. We did a great job of messaging the game to the public. I don't think it was something we were concerned about at the beginning, because the pedigree of Obsidian is very much RPGs, and this game deviates from that. I mean, it is a role-playing game. You play the role of Andreas, but the feeling of the game is very much more an adventure game, or maybe a point-and-click vibe, or something more like
esatto, io quando ho visto il gioco la prima volta ho pensato a un'avventura punta e clicca.
When we would talk to the fans in any way we could, we would often be sure to say that. We'd be like, hey, this is not exactly what we normally do here. Hopefully you can see that by just looking at the art and the characters walking around, but don't expect a ton of crunchy numbers, don't expect combat, don't expect all of that, but do expect that narrative, that choice and consequence, that feeling that Obsidian evokes through our storytelling. And I think when we talked to the fans a lot about that and talked to the press about it beforehand, their expectations were completely set, and we felt pretty confident in that coming out.
I never had any big expectations for how the game would do sales-wise, and I don't think anyone really did. Being on Game Pass, the expectation was that there would be kind of buzz about there being a unique game on the platform, and I was happy. I knew that people would perceive it as being unique, and I was not actually sure about the reviews. I thought the reviews were going to be lower than they actually were. As people are very fond of saying at the beginning or end of every Pentiment review, now this game isn't for everybody, as though any game is for everybody. But this one really is not for everybody, I guess. Yeah, I thought a lot of people were going to kind of come into it and just look at it real sideways and be like, this is not it. And there were a few reviews that were very much like, no thank you, which is fine. But it reviewed better than I expected it to. And yeah, I was happy that it got nominated for a bunch of stuff. But we won the GDC Narrative Award, and I was very happy about that. Okay. And I realized later, I feel like every game developer eventually becomes Act 2 Andreas. Like if they stay in the industry long enough, they eventually kind of get to this like fried mental state, and they're like, yeah, that's me.
I mean, I think the team seniority really helped us out. Like, we really didn't hire any sort of, juniors or even mids per se that were really part of the core team. Everybody was doing senior level work on the team, and that really helped us out. Everybody was able to take a feature, break it down, work with each other without any sort of overhead of extra meetings or communication because of the team size. So it really allowed us to allow Josh to focus really on the narrative and that important aspect. We really were on the same wavelength, and that really is a testament to Josh's direction on the title. So like with Josh's direction, we were able to really get a good vibe of what we were looking for, and then through that we could just communicate directly with each other. If I needed something from animation or animation needed something from programming, we would just communicate directly and kind of get that taken care of without having to like bring it up in some sort of process or thing that might slow down the production.
At the end of Pentiment, did you feel like, oh, these are games like I could make this type of game forever? Did you get an inkling for something bigger, like creatively, sort of where were you?
Yeah, I think coming out of it, yeah, I think I could make smaller games. I think I could make bigger games again. I think what I realized between Deadfire and Pentiment. Deadfire I was super burned out because it was, even though I was very happy about how it was critically received, it didn't sell well initially, and it was super draining, and there were a lot of compromises that we had to make in developing it, and I didn't feel good about any of that. I felt like it was just compromise after compromise after compromise, like, okay, we'll do this, we'll get it done. And with Pentiment, we didn't take our sweet ass time on it. Like, it was 3 years, which, by the way, is the longest I've worked on any game in 25 years. I've worked on other games that eventually got canceled for about that long, but in terms of actually released games, 3 years is the longest I've worked on a game. But I realized the important thing is that it's not that you don't compromise on anything, but you can't go into making a game for, I guess, the wrong reasons. You got to genuinely be excited about the game that you're going to work on. And I know that's a luxury, but for me and where I am, I can't make games where I'm not super genuinely fully excited about doing it. I can't come in and be like, well, you know, I'm not really happy about where we're going with this, but I guess we got to get it done. I just can't do it anymore. So with Pentiment, I'm very happy not only with how it wound up, but the process of making it was not one where we made lots of compromises. There were things where we said, okay, we're not going to have the budget to do that. We're not going to be able to do that. That's okay. Those were sane and sober conversations we had. But we never made any choices where it felt like this fundamentally compromises the vision of the game and the experience that we're going to give players. And that's, I think, the important thing. And especially as someone directing a game, because I have to get the people around me excited about what we're working on. If I'm not super into it, it's just going to be everyone's like, dude, the guy directing the game is not even into this. Like, this is not going well. So coming out of it, it was really like, I just got to make sure that whatever I work on now, I really truly believe I have a vision for this. I'm excited about it. I think the players are going to be jazzed about it, and people who are working on it are going to be jazzed about it. And if we have to make compromises because that's the world that we live in, they don't just undermine that passion.
Perché tanti onestamente hanno un posto di lavoro, capito? Dicono la loro, fanno quello che devono e... Credimi quando ti dico, ho conosciuto un po' di persone, ormai, così. Hanno raccontato di storie di ragazzi normalissimi che senza alcun motivo se ne escono con un 8,5 a un titolo che il resto della redazione avrebbe visto come massimo un 7. Succede. Ok, ragazzi. Questo era il documentario su Pentiment ed è veramente bello. Mi ha lasciato veramente sorpreso quanto questo team, che ha realizzato un prodotto che già sapevo che era un gioco fatto con estrema cura, con estremo amore, attenzione e passione, ma mi ha veramente sorpreso la quantità di cose e il livello di dettaglio e di maniacalità da certi punti di vista che hanno raggiunto, ma anche con una certa nonchalance. Avete visto con che facilità Josh Sawyer e anche le due ragazze si occupavano della parte artistica e dell'animazione, parlavano con estrema competenza di un sacco di piccole cose, veramente figo. È stato sorprendente. Perché sapevo della cura, dell'amore, del dettaglio, ma non fino a questo punto. Mi ha davvero sorpreso, ragazzi, ed è stata una gran esperienza. E ovviamente, vabbè, NoClip è ormai una garanzia, non penso neanche di doverlo dire. In tutta onestà è un qualcosa che non smette di sorprendere quanto bene fanno i documentari i ragazzi di NoClip, e ormai ne hanno fatte a decine, quindi direi che ci siamo, ok?